Hello, and welcome to Mr. Faye's Science Basement, where today we're going to continue our talk of the theory of evolution. Let me give you a quick recap. Today we're going to be asking a big question, but we need to review some of the concepts we've talked about. So when we're looking at the idea of evolution, all we've been doing is looking at evidence for why people think that evolution has taken place. One is the fact that DNA can mutate over time. Very small changes in sequences of A's, G's, C's, and T's when you look into DNA sequences can change and go wrong or make mistakes along the way. Now, those changes are usually pretty small and often are really, really bad, but every once in a while it could give you a characteristic that's a little bit beneficial. But again, those changes are usually pretty small. So, in order to have a major amount of change, you'd need to have a lot of time. Which brings us to the second thing we looked at, which is the natural history timeline. When you look at the Earth has a lot of time going on in its history. So we have 4.5 billion years worth of time, worth of mutations for change to take place. And that's a lot of time, especially when you look in scale of the activity that we did with the ruler. Other stuff. When we dig in the ground, we find fossils. And those fossils that we find, especially right here in central New York, are about those fossils reference things that don't exist anymore. So when we look into the Earth's past, into the fossil record, we find species that no longer exist on the planet, which again gives us that idea of change. Things must have changed over time in order to give us that type of data that we see. When you go super specifically into the data, we start to notice things like transitional forms, which means that as you go back into fossils that are older and older, as they progress through, you'll see trends and changes of different characteristics. We can also look in living things today and look at the structures inside arms of mammals and flippers and in whales, which are also mammals, and look for correlations or relationships. Finally, one of the last things that we looked at was the molecular evidence, the fact that DNA and amino acid sequences in the macromolecules that are inside living things are very closely related to each other. And the more related the species are to each other, the more sequences they have in common. And that seems consistent with a lot of the other models that kind of are generated from the data that we just mentioned from those pieces of evidence. So let's get into it. So if we accept this idea that evolution is happening and has happened, and that life evolves from other life, and all the life that we have today is somehow related to each other through common ancestry, then there is one huge question that needs to be asked about that chain of life. And I'm just curious if you can pause the video right now and write down how you would finish this sentence. If life evolves from other life, then I'm going to pause it right there and have you finish that statement with a big question. Okay, so one of the most common questions that students will write when I pose this to them is, if all life comes from other life, then where the heck did the first life come from? How did the first life appear on this planet? Did it happen spontaneously, where it just kind of was born from the rocks? Did it come down by some alien source or something like that? And that's a really hot topic right now in biology. We're going to take a look at two really traditional experiments that get at the idea of where the first life could have come from. And they both deal with this idea of spontaneous generation. Now, spontaneous generation is the idea that life can come from nothing. Okay? Life is able to come about from things that are not alive. And there are two famous experiments which investigate this. In this area over to the right here, feel free to pause the video and write down some of the notes that explain what you see over here. One of the first things that we're going to look at is a famous experiment called the Reddy experiment. Okay, and this scientist looked at meat. Okay. Now, the common thought of the time was, if you leave meat out, meat will rot and will have maggots in it and all those types of things. And a lot of scientists thought that that was spontaneous generation. It was just a life force that sprung up out of the meat and gave rise to new life. So Reddy was questioning this, and he was wondering whether or not this was true. So what he found is, if you put some raw meat in a jar here that was open, and he put some raw meat in a jar that was tightly sealed, up top, so nothing can get in and out. And then he took some raw meat, but this he covered with something called like cheesecloth. It's like a porous cloth. If you look at it like a bandana or a piece of fabric, something where the air can get through, but nothing else. He ran these three setups against each other to see whether or not that meat could give off life all by itself. So what he found was in the meat jar that was open, he wound up with rotten meat that had maggots eating through it. Okay. In the one that was tightly sealed, in other words, nothing could get in or out. He found that the meat did not have maggots on it. And then the cheesecloth, this was the weirdest, the one that was porous and allowed air through. We'd have the meat inside, but we'd wind up with maggots on top of the cheesecloth. So what he deduced from this is that the maggots themselves actually came from the flies that were coming in contact with the meat. And that's something that we do know today, that maggots are the larval stage of flies. They're baby flies that have hatched. So in the open jar, the flies were able to fly in, lay their eggs in the meat, and then the maggots would hatch in the meat and eat it. Here, where it was sealed, no flies were able to come in contact with the meat at all. Okay, they couldn't even smell it or anything, so the flies didn't even come around. Okay, and there was nothing on the meat. There were no maggots. The one that's most interesting, again, is the cheesecloth that is porous. Flies were flying around the top, and maggots would appear on the top of the cheesecloth. So again, the flies could smell or sense that there was meat down there, lay some eggs, but the meat never wound up with any maggots on it. So what's the point? The point is this disproves the idea that maggots are spontaneously generated. They don't just come about by some life force. They need to be placed there by living things, which are the flies depositing their eggs. So this goes against the idea of spontaneous generation and makes us know that life has to come from other life. Over here, we have a similar experiment from Pasteur, who runs kind of the same thing, except more on a microscopic level, looking at bacteria. So if we take a look here, we have some sort of, this is almost like I always looked at it as like a soup broth or like a beef broth, some food source, similar to like we had a piece of meat here. So it's like some soup, let's say. And he found that when he heated it in this cool little flask that had this little curved top, brought it to a boil and let it sit, that no bacteria became present in it at all. Okay, so killed the bacteria and no new bacteria was able to get in through spores in the air or anything like that. He found that if he did the same thing, but he broke the top so that air could get in, air with the bacterial spores on it, then the bacteria did wind up growing in the solution right there. But he also found that if you took it, boiled it, and tipped it on its side, so this was in contact with the little loop, that bacteria, again, would grow in there because bacteria have a way to contact the liquid. So in this situation, actually found that there are elements in the air which are alive, again, bacterial spores and probably fungal spores and things like that, that are able to work their way in. Now, in this situation, they would all settle in the tube and wouldn't wind up in here, which is why you don't have any growth. But again, if you break the tube, you'll have growth because life is getting in. And if you take the tube, put it on the side, life can still contact that part right there, and then it'll end up growing through. So again, this disproves the idea of spontaneous generation and shows that life must come from somewhere. All right, so knowing this, I guess I'm going to put the question to you, and you can get ready to pause the video. So if, according to these two experiments, all life comes from some other living thing, the maggots come from the flies, the bacteria come from bacterial spores, then what are some possible explanations for where the first life came from on the planet? Because if you remember, the planet goes for hundreds of millions of years before there's any life on it. And then all of a sudden, like this, life appears in the fossil record in a very, very simple form. So why don't you pause the video and come up with some suggestions as to how that could have taken place. All right, so I'm sure you got a variety of examples of how you think life could have first shown up on the planet. And this is something that scientists are grappling with. They've been working really hard on this. And one of the most interesting experiments that has been done looking for where the first life could have come from the planet is basically set up like this. And this is another famous one that is a lot more recent than the ones that you saw, but you'll see a lot of variations in this in textbooks that you have. Basic idea is this. The early atmosphere. When we look back at the oldest rocks that we have on the planet, we can tell what the early atmosphere was like, and it was different than the atmosphere that we have today. It had a lot of nitrogen in it, just like we do today, but it was relatively low in oxygen and very different type of atmosphere than we have today. Also, we had a lot more radiation reaching the Earth from the sun due to the type of atmosphere that we had, and we also had more volatile temperatures and things like that. So it was a really nasty, nasty, nasty volatile environment. And some of the things that were really high in the atmosphere, which aren't anymore, are methane gas, which is a C with 4 little H's around it, is a pretty explosive, very, very simple organic gas that seems to be present, and ammonia. Ammonia is an incredibly caustic chemical, and it's a NH3 actually, so it's an N with 3 little H's around it. So those are things that were in the atmosphere, and those things were not very conducive to life at all. So what scientists did in a nutshell is they took those early conditions and they tried to mimic them, okay, in this little chamber right here. So what they did is they took water, and if you go back into the geologic record, you can find about when water started to appear on the planet. So they boiled some water vapor up and started mixing it with some of the gases that were around in the early atmosphere. So methane and ammonia and those types of things. And they could mimic the early atmosphere right in this chamber here. So once they got all of these components in the chamber here that kind of mimics that early atmosphere, they also introduced some radiation and some sparks like lightning, which tend to jolt and kind of excite electrons and all those types of things. So they were thinking they could make this early atmosphere right here, kind of like in a chamber, and let that run for a few years, or I mean, in the Earth's case, a few 100 million years, and see what you eventually get out. Can you get life to come out of here simply by mixing together those ingredients and shocking it? Well, no, you can't make cells, and we didn't have like dinosaurs pop out of there. However, in a relatively short period of time, things started to precipitate out of here, started to actually condense and appear. And those things were the building blocks of the organic molecules that we learned about in the beginning of the year. So this right here is a huge finding. It shows that you can take the components of the early atmosphere and manipulate them in a way that they would have been manipulated billions of years ago, and actually spontaneously create the building blocks of life, like things that are like nucleic acids and amino acids, things that like the phospholipids that will make up cell membranes. All of those spontaneously appeared by themselves. So now project that out, not just doing it for a couple months or doing it for a few weeks or even doing it for a few years, but do that for hundreds of millions of years. And it starts to become more plausible that those first simple cells could be spontaneous. So putting all of the data together, everything that we see in the geologic record, the fossil record, knowing what we know chemically about the atmosphere, about when life first appears in the fossil record, this is the current hypothesis for how life started. And believe it or not, it's really different than most people think, and a lot of people were traditionally taught. A lot of students coming in think, okay, I understand. Plants came first, and then animals came to eat the plants and all those types of things. That is way too simplistic, looking at this whole model. So the current model that we look at when we talk about how life could have started on the planet is something known as the heterotroph hypothesis, which is written right up here. It's the idea that heterotrophs came first. So excuse me. And let's take a peek. So, through the process that you just saw in the experiment that was run, scientists speculate that the first things that came about were organic compounds. Okay, so your organic compounds. So I'm trying to type and talk at the same time. Organic compounds came first. How? By this. Once those organic compounds appear, then after millions of years, the first things to appear on the planet are things that fed on the energy in those organic compounds. Okay, so the heterotrophs were the first living thing that came about, feeding on the energy in the organic compounds that were spontaneously made in the atmosphere. Once that happened, you now are creating a atmosphere that allows for autotrophs to take hold. So again, these will start increasing these will start increasing the carbon dioxide in the air and those types of things, which then allow for our autotrophs. And that right there is the heterotroph hypothesis. The current understanding that organic compounds came first, then single celled, the simplest organisms you could imagine, kind of like bacteria or prokaryotes, which fed on organic compounds, which then led to the autotrophs. The autotrophs were more complex because they started to have systems that could take sunlight and convert them into food that they could eat. Then heterotrophs started eating autotrophs, and autotrophs started producing, and that gave us kind of like the cycle that we have today. But believe it or not, that's where most scientists think that all of this began. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in an upcoming Zoom conference or send me a message along with the assignment. Thanks. See ya.